Hello everyone, welcome to our webinar. I am Daita Sergi, Education Programs Manager with AASHE, and I'll be the moderator today. It is my pleasure to welcome you all. As many of you know, AASHE's mission is to inspire and catalyze higher education to lead the global sustainability transformation. We are an international association with about 1,000 members spread across more than 20 countries, including Denmark and Taiwan. We serve as a professional home for campus sustainability staff, but we offer resources for everyone in higher education. We provide an expansive collection of online resources, networking tools, and educational events, such as today's webinar, as well as an annual conference and expo, which will take place in Spokane, Washington, starting this coming Sunday. If you did not get a chance to register but would like to join us, you can still do so on site, and I hope I'll see you all at the conference. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. Everyone in the audience is on mute, but please feel free to ask questions or provide comments at any point during the presentation. You can do so by typing your questions or comments in the questions pane in the control panel on your screen. If you have additional questions, please email them to education@aashe.org and we will get back to you. At the end of the webinar, you'll have the opportunity to provide feedback regarding today's presentation. We take your suggestions into account when planning for future webinars, so please do provide this feedback. Please note this webinar is being recorded. If you experience technical difficulties or have to leave early, you and others can view the recording later. The recording and presentation materials will all be available in the Campus Sustainability Hub after the live broadcast. At this time, I'd like to introduce today's webinar presenters. But before I go to do that, I'd like to tell you all how pleased we've been to collaborate with Root Solutions on the Turning the Page project and are excited about some of the initial results at participating institutions. So today we'll have Naya, who co-founded Root Solutions and has served as a nonprofit's executive director since its inception in 2014. Lauren, who coordinates the Turning the Page on Campus pay-per-use program, through which she has supported the development and implementation of paper-saving campaigns on 20 campuses, and Elaine, who is responsible for the overall coordination of sustainability practices and programs at Portland Community College's Rock Creek campus, and she was an active participant in the Turning the Page on Campus pay-per-use program. And she will talk about her experience more today. So more information about the presenters is found on the AASHE website under this webinar listing. It is my pleasure to welcome all attendees and thank you for joining us today. At this time, I'm going to turn over to Lauren to get us started.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Lauren, and I'm our manager of projects and partnerships at Root Solutions. And we are an environmental behavior change nonprofit based in the Bay Area. And we help organizations design and implement programs and campaigns that are more effective at promoting environmental action. We do this directly through working on client projects, but also through capacity building programs like workshops and the Turning the Page program. We also are working on publishing a book that will come out in 2020 called Designing for Environmental Action, a Practitioner's Guide. And I also wanted to go give Elaine a chance just to introduce herself a little bit more before we get into everything.
Thanks, Lauren. I'm the sustainability coordinator at our Rock Creek campus for Portland Community College. For those of you that don't know, Portland Community College is located throughout the Portland, Oregon greater metro area. We have 4 main campuses and 6 different centers. There are over 70,000 students on all of our campuses, but I'm at one rural campus. It's about 264 acres, and that's where this case study took place, and I'll be talking about that further.
Okay, great. Thanks, Elaine. So just to go over our goals for today's webinar, we want to give you a better understanding of what behavior design is and why it matters for higher ed institutions. We also want to share our behavior design process and some examples from the Turning the Page on Campus Paper Use program, and also to introduce you to the toolkit that we have been working on and how you can use it to initiate and implement behavior-based paper reduction campaigns and other sustainability campaigns on your campus. So why focus on paper and printing? So not everyone realizes this, but paper and printing does have significant impacts for campuses and the environment. As many of you know, if you are on this webinar, you probably know that paper and pulp manufacturing contribute to air and water pollution, deforestation, and human rights abuses. And campuses also use large numbers of paper, ink, individual desktop printers, and ultimately this can result in millions of sheets of paper per campus per year. And this can come at significant cost to universities in the form of paper storage and transportation, recycling of toner cartridges, lost documents, printer maintenance and support, and more. And depending on the size of the institution and how many desktop printers they have, it can cost hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars a year. And so why focus on behavior change? So because paper and printing is inherently a behavioral problem, we can turn to, so ultimately, paper use is driven by individual behavior. Every time someone prints coursework that can be done online, or staff print an email or a meeting agenda, or faculty print lecture slides, these are all individual behaviors. And even setting policies like restricting desktop printers or requiring certain documents be printed, or decisions to pursue and adopt technologies, these all come back to individual behavior and decisions. Excuse me, I'm having a little bit of trouble with my screen, so just bear with me for a second.
I'll take this opportunity to note that in the previous slide was a photo from our college warehouse where old toner cartridges were palletized to be recycled, and there were pallets and pallets of them. That's just one example of the waste in terms of printer use and personal printer use, but we were able to document that.
Sorry, having some technical difficulties.
And that also goes to Lauren's point that she made. You think about the pallets of toners that are sitting in storage or wherever they might be. They're taking up space. You're using more staff time on that, as well as the waste. So there's quite a few different, categories and effects on just that one piece of the toners. How you doing, Lauren?
Good, thanks, Elaine. Sorry, everyone. All right, so this is why behavior change is needed for paper use. And so because it's inherently a behavioral problem, we can use behavior design to help us solve this problem. And behavior design is basically just an evidence-based process that we use to encourage environmental behavior change. We draw on research from the fields of cognitive science, conservation psychology, behavioral economics, social marketing, and design thinking, and all with the goal of promoting pro-environmental behavior change. And so why do we need this field of work? Oh gosh, I keep having issues. It keeps switching. Okay. We need behavior design because for the last few decades, the environmental movement has operated under this model that if we can only provide people with more information about the problem, then they'll be more aware and then their behavior will change. But unfortunately, this model has been proven wrong time and time again. We know that information is insufficient. We all know, for example, in our own lives that exercise is important and eating lots of fruits and vegetables is important, but that doesn't mean that we do it. So we know that information and awareness isn't the only thing driving behavior. And worse, information-based campaigns, when they're not done correctly, can even backfire. And so this means that we haven't always used our resources most efficiently. And it means we have ignored and not leveraged many of the other barriers and motivators of behavior. A great example of this that's not directly related to the environment, but is a great case study, is the My Anti-Drug campaigns of the late 90s and early 2000s. So these campaigns spent a lot of money. It was a very mass media campaign. It did a lot of things right as far as getting coverage for their campaign. It was in commercials and movies and used sports stars as representatives. However, it actually ended up, because it showed so many young people using drugs, the ad actually backfired because people that were exposed to the ads actually became more likely to start using drugs because they then believed that marijuana use was even more prevalent than it actually was. And so this campaign actually backfired. And this is because social norms were actually a bigger driver of behavior than awareness of negative consequences. And so because of things like this is why we initiated the Turning the Page on Campus Paper Use program. And the goal is to teach higher education institutions how to use behavior change to implement more effective campaigns. And so through this program, since 2017, we've coached about 10 campuses in the US and Canada through our process for developing campaigns. And this starts at the AASHE conference, and we do about a half day to a full day training, introducing everyone to the human-centered design process for behavior change, and also introducing them to some of our behavioral building blocks. And then this is followed by monthly, bi-monthly webinars where we are digging into their campaign, as we'll do together today as well, but also on additional building blocks that we didn't cover in the first conference. And then we do weekly and monthly sharing and troubleshooting calls as a group, as well as one-on-one coaching. And so now we're going to do our first poll about what kinds of paper reduction initiatives have you tried on your campus? We have removing desktop printers, installing print management software, reduction of specific sources of paper, or none yet, and that's why you're here.
Thank you, Lauren. The poll is now live for our attendees, and if there's anything else that you did as a reduction initiative that is not one of these options, feel free to submit it through the questions pane as a comment. So we'll leave it open for a few more seconds to give everybody a chance to vote, and then I'm gonna go ahead and close the poll, And let's see the results. So it looks like 67% chose the first and second option, so removing desktop printers and installing print management software, with 40% on reduction of specific sources of paper, and then 33% at overall paper reduction, and 13% none yet. So we do have an audience there for for the last option.
Yeah, okay, yeah, thanks everyone for sharing. And I'm impressed to see that so many of you have attempted the tough issue of removing desktop printers.
Yeah.
Talking a lot about that in this webinar too. Okay, so for our first cohort, participants were able to choose their own target audience and behavior that they wanted to focus on. So many, like you guys, did choose to work on replacing desktop printers with networked printers, also known as multifunction devices or multifunction printers. Others also worked on getting faculty or students to use online learning platforms, such as Canvas, instead of printing. And some also focused on moving promotional materials like flyers online. In cohort 2, from our experience working with cohort 1 and from our research, we knew that focusing on desktop printer removal was potentially the #1 printing related behavior that you can do as far as the environmental impact, the paper impact, energy, and cost. So it has really huge potential. And some estimates show that it can even result in about 40% in cost savings for printing and paper-related costs, just by switching from desktop printers to networked multifunction printers. It also lends itself well for a cohort project because it is a very difficult behavior change, and you can use all the help you can get working on this type of behavior. As Elaine will also, I'm sure, share with you more. And so based on these experiences from cohort 1 and cohort 2, we have been working for the past couple years to develop a Turning the Page toolkit so that anyone that wasn't part of the cohort can use the research, the process, and the findings from this process to bring it back to their campus, even though you might not have been able to participate in this program. And our webinar today will roughly follow the way the toolkit is laid out, but we start with selecting our audience and the target behavior. Once we know the target behavior, we're uncovering the barriers and motivators of that behavior as our audience sees them. Once we've uncovered those barriers and the benefits, what we like to call determinants or drivers, we identify which interventions, which behavioral interventions are best suited to address those. And then the toolkit also includes campus case studies of schools we've worked with through the cohort and also outside of the Turning the Page project. All right, and so already ready for our next poll. And so who is or who would be your target audience for your paper saving campaign?
Okay, so let's give everyone a couple more seconds to make sure they had a chance to vote. And I'm gonna go ahead and close the poll. So results show 88% staff, 76% faculty, and 41% students. Back to you.
All right, so a lot of students. Okay. We will talk, I'd say, more about staff and faculty today, but our Haas School of Business case study is all about students. So if you're focused on students, you'll definitely want to check that case study out. Yeah, but most are based on faculty and staff. Okay. So we also provide in the toolkit an exercise and a worksheet to help you determine your target audience. So, in some cases, your target audience might already be determined for you and you don't have a choice. So if you have to work with faculty or you can't work with faculty and you have to work with students. But other times it's wide open to you and you have the option. So in those cases, we've created a worksheet and exercise to help you determine that. And so some things to think about are the contribution to the problem. So, are staff printing more than faculty? Also, how receptive and willing to engage is the target audience? So this might be, you might think about, are there departments with green teams that are really excited about this issue? Or on the other hand, are there groups that are going to be unreceptive or difficult to work with? Maybe they're laggards as far as their responsiveness to new technologies or to sustainability campaigns. If they're laggards, you might not want to work with them to start. Or if, for example, they recently underwent some kind of campaign already and they might be having campaign fatigue, then you might not want to work with that audience. And then thinking about all of those things that can also help you figure out, what is their fit for being a pilot program for your initiative to test run before you implement it with a wider group. And so you can think about those other questions, but also things like, is this target audience, say it's a certain department that's well respected by other departments, and it will be a good pilot that other departments will look to. So I just kind of skimmed the surface, but in the worksheet and then in the toolkit, we go into a lot more detail with questions that can help you determine your target audience. And then after that, you are brainstorming all the behaviors that if your audience took that action, it would help you reach your goal. And so think about which actions or business processes use the most paper. And so you can obviously brainstorm these yourself, but also ask your target audience, what parts of their job or their lives require the most paper use. You can also think about it a little bit differently and think by location, and that might help you come up with some other behaviors that you might not have thought of. For example, remembering that, whenever I'm in the library, I notice that there's lots of abandoned paper at the printers. So this is also a case where using observation and audits can be helpful. So you might also take a peek into the waste bins or the recycling bins and see, what items are being discarded and seem like they weren't being used. They were being printed but never being used. And this is also just a good time to kind of remind everyone that our goals are not behaviors. So our overall goal of reducing paper use is our goal, but then we want to think about specific behaviors that help us reach that goal. And then on a similar note, having our audience be aware of or understand or care about something is also not a behavior. What are behaviors are some of these things listed here. So from doing that brainstorming exercise, you would hopefully come up with several different paper saving behaviors. And in the toolkit, we've put them into some categories to help you sort them. And I only included 2 per category here, but in the toolkit, there are lots for you to choose from or to, start as a jumping off point for your own paper saving behavior ideas. And then we also have an exercise. Once you have, a handful of behaviors, you can use this worksheet to prioritize which one you want to work on or which 1 or 2 you want to work on. And so you can use several criteria, the first being impact. So what level of impact will this behavior have? So to use a non-paper example, we know that riding your bike to work every day has a much better impact than just carpooling, for example. Also, what is the saturation in your target audience? So if saturation is low and only a few people are doing the behavior, then getting more people to do that behavior would obviously have a very big impact. Likelihood of success would be the next one. So what is the probability of adoption? You know, how difficult is this behavior? How has this audience, you know, been about adopting other similar behaviors in the past? Is it a controversial behavior? And what is the level of organizational effort required from your end to make this initiative successful? Then we also have future impact. So thinking about what is there potential to scale this initiative, or is it, you know, is it a good proof of concept so that you can use this as your test run and show that it worked, and you can then impact many different departments and audiences on campus. And then finally, evaluation. So are you actually able to observe the behavior? If people are doing it, will you even be able to know that and to be able to collect that data and then to be able to evaluate your success? And so you can use this worksheet. There's space for up to 8 behaviors. And even if you don't end up choosing the one that comes out with the highest score, it can be a really useful exercise to kind of test your assumptions and to get you thinking in advance about some of these issues, such as data collection, for example. And now Elaine, she went through these processes in the beginning of her project, and she's going to talk to you guys a little bit about how she chose her audience and behavior.
Great. Well, I want to share a little bit about the background for my work. I studied community-based social marketing as a behavior change model for my PhD work, and part of that was looking at greening offices and paper reduction. So I already came with some research around looking at behavior change around paper reduction in higher ed in offices. So I had my own sort of personal hypothesis from that the biggest bang for our paper reduction buck would be reducing personal printers. So that's where that part stemmed from. And then in my work at Portland Community College, I got the sustainability office on my campus. I got put into an academic department where I was able to work with a dean when we moved our office in a big department to eliminate all the personal printers and have in the move have everyone try to reduce and eliminate all personal printers. I was also working on energy conservation behaviors at the same time. And with that transition, with that move, we were able to do it. Eliminate personal printers and have everybody connected to a network printer. So there I had kind of a firsthand experience. So that's in the end why I really wanted to choose this behavior, personal printers, printer reduction. And then for me, it was an easy choice with the target audience because I wanted just to focus on staff and faculty and those personal printers in all the departments on my campus.
Thank you, Elaine.
Mm-hmm.
All right, and then once you have, decided on your target audience and your target behavior, you're ready to start to uncover what are your audience's barriers and motivators of this behavior. And in doing this, you also want to take note that every behavior has multiple other behaviors that lead up to that final outcome producing behavior. So in this case, if the behavior that's actually going to produce the outcome we want is that somebody disconnects their desktop printer and brings it over to IT, then there are actually multiple behaviors that come before that, such as even, opening the email in the first place that tells them that they can give up their desktop printer, to then, attending the informational meeting, getting set up on the shared printer before they get rid of their desktop printer. And so when you're thinking about barriers, you want to be thinking about not just the barrier for that final behavior, but all the ones that are leading up to it. And so before we dig into the different categories of determinants and barriers, I want to ask you guys, what has been, or do you think will be, the biggest barrier for your paper reduction initiatives?
Daita?
Oh, there we go.
I'm here, just clicking through the different buttons and making sure it's the right poll and we don't do again the one of the previous polls. So sorry for that, but here it is.
And if you are thinking of any that aren't listed here, because there definitely are some that aren't listed here, you can go ahead and write those down, you know, on your own, potentially write them in the chat, or just think about them for later.
All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and close the poll. So let's see. 44% chose the third option. People are too busy to save paper, with 19% each for the fourth and fifth option. People don't think it is their responsibility, or people have trouble remembering to save paper. 13% at the first one, people don't think paper is an important issue, and only 6% for people don't know how to save paper.
Right. Interesting. Okay, so keep those in mind as we go through the details here of different determinants, generally for environmental behaviors, but also for paper. So right now we just had you brainstorm the barriers, but what you'll really want to do is to do what we call a determinants analysis. And this is a survey, and it is used to reveal what is actually motivating or deterring your audience. And the key thing is that it's from the audience's perspective. So, you know, we all have experience, and we all ourselves use paper, so we can certainly brainstorm what we think the barriers are. But especially if we're different from our audience, we really want to find out what those are from their perspective. And so it's really important to at the very least, have informal conversations, but at best to do a full determinants analysis survey. And Elaine and everyone in our cohort for Turning the Page did these, and Elaine will talk a little bit about her experience doing that. And so based on our work experience and from the literature, we've identified 12 of the most common drivers of environmental behavior. And we're going to go over each one of these in detail. So the first, and maybe the first one that comes to mind too, is perceived negative consequences or negative attributes. So these are all of the negative things that a person thinks will happen, or they already have experienced as a result of performing the behavior. So for paper, it could be things like, I dislike having to walk to the printer, you know, staring at the computer hurts my eyes, so I want to print things, or the shared printer always breaks down. We hear that one a lot for desktop printers, is that the desktop printer is unreliable, it's always broken. And we'll also come back to this one about having to walk to the printer. Elaine will talk a bit about that.
Yep.
Perceived benefits. So this is the perception that something positive may or will happen as a result of doing the behavior. So these are, you know, what the person sees as, it could be the positive reasons to act, or the negative things that could be caused by inaction. So this could be things like, I like getting exercise by walking to the shared printer. I feel good knowing I'm saving trees when I use less paper, or using a multifunction printer saves me time. Lots of different things can go in this category. Perceived susceptibility, and this is the perception that the problem impacts me or the people that I care about, or that it could in the future. So statements you might see that relate to susceptibility are, you know, I'm not directly impacted by deforestation, so I don't really care about this. Printing, or on the flip side, printing contributes to climate change, which impacts us all. Related to susceptibility is perceived severity and importance. So this is the person's perception of how serious the problem is compared to other issues. So someone might think they're susceptible, but might still not think that it's really all that serious or important. We see this statement a lot, is that universities should be worrying about things bigger than paper. But we can talk about this in building blocks, but you can also then talk about how actually paper does tie into some of these bigger things like budgets and climate change and waste. Perceived ability and self-efficacy. So this is the perception that the person can identify the appropriate course of action, or that they have the knowledge, the skills, and the judgment they need to succeed at the action. So a common barrier for the multifunction printers is people just not really knowing how to use them, or not knowing how to use specific functions like putting scrap paper in or doing letterhead. On the flip side, or not on the flip side, but for other issues like using Canvas, we might hear people say they either are very confident using the course tools like Canvas, or that they're not confident at all in how to use Canvas to teach their course. Memory and cues for action. This one's really important. So even if someone feels like they have the efficacy, as we just discussed, they still might have a hard time just remembering to do it, or remembering all the steps involved. We all have so much information thrown at us every day and so many decisions to make that we can pretty much, this is the one barrier that we can pretty much always assume is a barrier, is memories or not having cues for action. So we'll talk about this in the building blocks, but you always want to help people out with memory. So things like forgetting to print double-sided, forgetting to proofread their document before they print, forgetting, to use scrap paper in the printer. Perceived action efficacy is the perception that if they do the behavior, it will actually solve or at least mitigate the problem, and how much of a difference will it make? So we definitely also see this a lot with papers that, how much I print isn't really going to make a very big impact. Giving up my desktop printer won't make a big impact. Or on the flip side, people do realize that giving up their desktop printer will have a large impact. Perceived responsibility. So then this is the person's perception that, they have a responsibility to address this problem. So in some cases, people see it as a problem, but it's not really their problem to solve. And we see that a lot too about, it's not my responsibility to make sure that the shared printer is working and it's always broken. So therefore, I don't want to use the shared printer. And then we have access and resources. And this is the perception, does the person have access to the services, the products, the time? A lot of you pointed out, people are just too busy to save paper, or the money required to adopt the behavior. And last but certainly not least is perceived social acceptability. We do this one last because it's super important, but also very underappreciated, is the perception that the action is performed and or accepted by one's social reference network. And so these are their peers or others whose opinion matters to them. A lot of research shows us that social norms and what our peers doing is one of the, if not the most influential thing on human behavior. But none of us like to think that we're very influenced by social norms. So its power often goes underappreciated. So we definitely want you to remember about how important social acceptability is. And I guess it wasn't quite the last one, but alignment with their ideologies and values. So, does the behavior you're asking them to do align with their values, their political identity, views on religion, for example? So as an environmentalist, I strongly believe in reducing paper use. Or on the flip side, I don't believe the university should be trying to influence anyone's behavior. The bureaucracy is already too big. So sometimes if someone holds those kinds of views, even if they, would be open to reducing their paper use, they are going to be very resistant to you trying to change their behavior. And we just want to note, these things are really hard to change and require much longer term interventions to change them, but that doesn't mean that we can't tap into these existing values and ideologies and worldviews through our behavioral interventions. And again, in the toolkit, we have put together a worksheet to help you through this process. So you have that behavior sequence there where you're brainstorming what are some of those other behaviors on the way to that final behavior that you really want people to do, and space to brainstorm not just the barriers to the behavior, but what would be some of the positive motivators that could influence someone to do each behavior in that step. But again, we're providing this and you can brainstorm them, but we definitely recommend doing more than brainstorming and actually going directly to your target audience to finding out what these are from their perspective. And Elaine is going to tell you a bit about her experience with doing a determinants analysis.
Yeah. Well, of course, as Lauren has talked about, you come in with some of your own perceptions and perceived ideas, but then it's nice to be able to get them out on paper and get out to your target audience. So that's what I did with our determinants analysis. And I thought we had a pretty good response rate with 102 good full surveys. And the main barriers that we discovered were the perceived expense. And actually the number one was confidentiality. And we asked confidentiality, concerns with networked printing was the exact statement that we had in our survey. And that had the highest rate. That was a big concern for a lot of people. And then sort of the addendum to that related to, but again, we're breaking down the barriers specifically. I don't know how to set up a secure access code on a networked printer. So we knew that we thought that could be a problem, but then when we put it out to our target audience, we really realized that the confidentiality and the concern about printing and leaving things in the printer in a public space was a big concern. But then when we would, talked to faculty, many of them didn't even know that you could secure print. So then that really took us down a whole other rabbit hole in which we had to create some tools and strategies to address that.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you, Elaine. And then as well as benefits that were revealed. Yeah,
our benefits list, again, is curious. We had a list of them and we were kind of surprised to find that the health benefit, getting up and walking to the networked printer, which often can be, could be 5 feet away or, 15 meters away. You don't know, depends on your office. But that got a big response as a benefit. And so we were excited about that. Up at the top was also just the sustainability aspect of it's more environmentally sustainable than a personal printer. So people wanted to do the right thing. And then that, then doing it is another piece. But the other benefit is they saw the efficiency of it. And we did ask about donating used printers. We already had an established program with our warehouse, as you can see in this photo, where old computers and sometimes printers would go to K-12 schools or some other nonprofit. And we put that in, and there was our target audience did demonstrate that was a benefit that they saw.
Great, thanks. Yeah, and we just wanted to come back again to this one about having to get up and walk to the printer. So in Elaine's case, her target audience was really excited about this and getting, a chance to get up and walk. Some people kind of see desktop printers as the new water, or multifunction printers as kind of the new water cooler. But some of the other schools in cohort 1 and cohort 2, they actually saw, the reverse, where more people actually said that a major reason they didn't want to use the multifunction printer was that they have to get up from their desk and walk, and it's distracting, or it's hard for them to get up and walk. So this is just a good example of, you never really know how your audience is going to respond, and so you definitely want to ask these kinds of questions. All right, and then this brings us to getting to our interventions. And so once we have identified the determinants, so that's those barriers, those motivators as identified by our audience, we're going to choose our behavioral strategies based on the results from that analysis. So that way we're really picking interventions based on our results and not just kind of picking them because they seem fun or because that's what everyone else has always done. It's really based on the results of your determinants analysis. And so now we're going to talk about each of our behavioral building blocks. And so just to go back, Root Solutions has taken all the research in this field of behavior design, behavioral science, and related fields, and there are hundreds of different behavioral interventions. And we have categorized them into what we call our behavioral building blocks. And these are also, you know, a main part of our book that will be coming out in 2020. And so utilize benefits is the first one. And this is all about, you know, how to use incentives or disincentives to kickstart change or to prevent people from doing the behaviors you don't want them to do. And the toolkit provides advice on, first and foremost, should you incentivize behaviors or outcomes? So there are instances where if you can't actually monitor, for example, whether people are doing the behavior, you might still be able to measure the outcome, and you could give incentives based on the outcome. And this is especially, yeah, for things where you can't actually see if people are doing it, but you can measure the ultimate outcome, like a reduction in energy use, for example, or paper use. You can't see all the things people are doing with their paper, but at the end of the month, you can see how many pages were printed. But there's other instances where incentivizing behaviors would be preferable, and the toolkit lays this all out for you so it can help you make that decision. Similarly, whether to focus more on intrinsic motivators or extrinsic rewards. And so as a blanket statement, we would say that whenever possible, try to avoid extrinsic rewards. And if your audience is already, you know, doing the behavior without rewards, then that's amazing, and there's no need to start to introduce extrinsic rewards. You know, just things like competence and personal growth and autonomy can be big enough motivators oftentimes to get people to do behaviors. But when you do need to use extrinsic rewards, we also provide lots of advice for how to use those. And some examples too are just things like lotteries, for example. And this also ties into the last building block, which is lasting, and the schedules of those rewards. And so we'll talk about that when we get to lasting. The next one is make it easy. And this is definitely one of the most important ones, because as we know, even the smallest hassle factor or smallest barrier, even something you don't think is actually a barrier, that can keep your audience from doing the behavior. So how can we make the behavior as convenient as possible? How can we create a supportive environment and infrastructure that encourages the behavior? In our communications, how can we, you know, make the information as clear as possible, reduce the number of steps? You can see here, these are both examples from Elaine where she's done an amazing job making something as easy as possible. You know, very detailed instructions on how to change your margin settings so that you can print more per page. And then actually, I'll let Elaine talk about the Greening Pacific example if she likes.
Yeah, it's a great paper reduction example where when I polled my target audience at Pacific University and asking them why they didn't use scrap paper in the printer, the photocopier, and the biggest response was they didn't know how to put it in there. Does what side goes up and how do you do that? And then so that was the biggest barrier. And so I just made a little prompt or a little cue that goes right on the photocopier or printer, and still using that today. It's just a simple thing, and it helps people overcome that barrier so easy.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, so simple, but can have a huge impact. Another thing that can be really simple and have a huge impact is setting defaults. So defaults fall under something called choice architecture, which essentially is just referring to, you know, the way that we structure choices or structure environments. Every environment, whether it's a physical environment or a website or a software program, does influence our behavior, even if we didn't intend it to. And so one example of these are defaults. And so I think we're all familiar with default double-sided printing. And I think most schools have implemented that at this point, but if you haven't yet, it's one of the easiest ways to reduce paper use because people no longer have to decide or have any barriers in their way. It just happens automatically. Other types of defaults would be, for desktop printers, for example, would be making it so that new employees do not receive a desktop printer. So the default is you don't get one, but in order to get one, you would have to opt in. So that's another example of a default. And then related to that too is erecting barriers to undesirable behaviors. So if you don't want people to use desktop printers, how can you make that behavior, you know, as difficult as possible? And as far as making things easy, we have, again, I don't know if Elaine wants to go into too much detail, but her Panther Print program at Portland Community College provides all kinds of instructions for people, for example, about step-by-step what they need to do in order to give up their desktop printer.
Yep.
And then for making it easy, our project we worked on at UC Berkeley Haas School of Business. You can't quite tell from this picture, but this is a tabletop prompt, and we'll talk about prompts in a minute. But this makes it super easy for students to take different steps to use less paper. Oh, Elaine, sorry, did you want to add anything about the print program?
No, you basically said it. We really provided a breakdown of a lot of the concerns, the barriers, and addressed the benefits in the Q&A that we developed on the website.
Yeah. Thank you. And then emphasize hopefulness. So this is all about replacing the doom and gloom narratives and messages with more positive messages that inspire action. So it can be tempting to use doom and gloom, and it can be effective in raising awareness, but it does not always result in actual change in behavior because it can lead us to kind of just feel defeated. And so then we end up not taking any action at all. So ways to counteract this are to highlight solutions and highlight the positive impacts of those solutions rather than just focusing on the problem. Cultivating conditions for self-efficacy. So how can we help people see how they can already contribute positively, or the things that they're already doing that are having a positive impact? How can we also, again, with that self-efficacy, what kinds of activities or games can we do to increase people's skills and knowledge so that they feel more hopeful about their ability? Also making things more of a collective endeavor so that we feel like, we're in it together, we're in it with another group of people that are all working on it so that we don't feel like we're just alone. And green teams are a good example of this. And then making sure that we demonstrate and celebrate progress and momentum. So, for example, here, here with the green teams, we have the collective endeavor, but also green teams are often, celebrating their wins and sharing them with the rest of the office. We also have, people doing hands-on work together that can also help people become hopeful. And then getting with the self-efficacy, things like, bingo type games, or games where you're helping people recall and brainstorm all the ways that they're, making a positive difference, can all be useful at promoting hopefulness. And Elaine, did you want to say anything about your green teams at Portland Community College?
Yeah, I want to say a couple things. One, I think for all of everybody listening that are practitioners in the field working on all of this, I think the hopefulness piece is really imperative for us, because it's tough. It's tough in the field in many different ways, and we need to stay positive. So I really hold on to that. And this is a photo of one of my green teams. And I just try to have a lot of fun with them, because a lot of the folks in my green team are administrative officers or working in staff positions, as well as faculty and students. But I just try to celebrate them, and there's always a fun factor in every meeting, and I really try to make it light and fun and educational as well. So that is a big part of my work.
And I can vouch too, I'm always smiling after a call with Elaine, so she does a great job of that. And then the next one is framing for the appropriate associations. So this is all about how we're framing our messages to speak to our audience's mental models and values, and again, not ours. So this includes things like leveraging cognitive biases, and we go into detail about various cognitive biases in the toolkit, but one example is this cognitive bias called loss aversion, and in this means that we're much more averse or wary of losses as compared to equal gains. So whenever you can frame a message as preventing loss, that can be very effective. So just an example, instead of talking about saving paper, you can say, don't lose precious time, go digital and never lose a piece of paper again. So the focus is more on preventing someone losing their precious time. Also, framing around, mental models and values. So for some people, emphasizing cost savings might be much more powerful than emphasizing environmental benefits. And again, that comes to really knowing your audience and what type of message is going to work for them. Also using metaphors for that big picture. And metaphors can really help us with systems thinking. Metaphors can also, they can just help take a big complicated issue and make it more digestible for us. So an example, we provide a couple examples in the toolkit, but one being that forests are air purifiers. And then finally, this building block is also about how to change frames over time. So we know that a lot of frames and mental models that people hold aren't necessarily great for the environment. And so ways that we can start to change that over time would be not repeating the negative frames or the negative phrases. And we go into, a lot more detail in that chapter, but this is also a very important building block. Design it to be vivid is all about how we overcome informational overload. So again, we all know we're deluged with so much information and so many different messages, and we really need to step it up in order to capture our audience's attention and to get them to remember our message. So it's about how do we make the desired behavior obvious? We'll show an example of that here. So things like green footprints, or even just signage that are making it very clear where you want your audience to go and what you want them to do. You might not be able to paint footprints in your office, but maybe you can provide some markings on the wall that lead people towards the recycling bin, for example, or to the multifunction printer so that they now know where it is. Prompting people at the point of behavior. Here we have a couple prompt examples. So prompts are very useful, again, for that overcoming that memory issue. So it should be for things where people generally know what to do, they just need help remembering to do it. So for example, prompts that remind people to check print preview first, We also have a prompt from our University of Iowa cohort participant where they were wanting to print less flyers, and so they created a prompt for tabling that said, say trees, kind of like say cheese, take a picture, save a flyer. So that was a prompt to encourage people to take a picture instead of grabbing a flyer. And then using metrics that really make the problem stand out. So this elephant example here is just a good, clever way of doing that. So, you know, not only saying the number of sheets of paper, but how can you translate that into things like an elephant or the size of a bear or the number of miles it would be if you stacked the reams of paper boxes, or how many pounds the paper boxes weigh. So just using more than just the basic statistics like paper or kilowatt hours, for example. And Elaine will also share an example later of using displays.
I love that elephant example. That just nails all the principles right there. It's so compelling.
Yeah.
And the data.
Yep, and these and other examples are all included in the toolkit for you all to reference as well. And then encourage consistent identity. This is all about how we can use our human desire for consistency to motivate positive action. So as humans, we all have a desire to appear consistent to others and to ourselves. And so this means that when we set a goal or we say that we're going to do something, just by doing that, we're more likely to follow through with that behavior because of this desire to appear consistent. And so this is why things like pledges, or which are also sometimes called commitment campaigns, can be so powerful. And we can also utilize this by helping our audience set realistic goals in the first place, but then also helping them develop things that are called implementation intentions, which are essentially if-then statements that help the audience walk through basically their plan for action and what they're going to do if, you know, if A happens, then I'm going to do B. And by doing that, we've also already committed more just by going through that exercise. We've now put more time in. And so that also makes us more likely to follow through on the behavior. Also related to identity, well, in the identity chapter is drawing on the appropriate identity. So using the words that elicit the positive identity that the person holds. So if people are environmentalists, using that word, but also just turning things into identity statements. So rather than just saying like, what will you do to save paper? You can say like, what will you do to be a paper saver? And research actually shows that turning things into identity statements like that can make people more likely to do the behavior.
Mm-hmm.
So a couple examples from our Haas School of Business case study. Cow bears are paper savers. So it's using that identity statement, but also tapping into the cow bear's identity. And this one also doubles as a prompt to remind people what to do. And similarly, we have an example of a pledge, and these are specific pledges. They also incorporate making it written and public, which are also important for pledges. So with these leaves, the design was that the person would write their name so that now people know who's pledging, and these leaves would be posted on a tree in the student hall. And so they would be very public as well as written, which are both things that result in greater follow-through. Demonstrate what is ordinary. This one is all about social norms, also one of our most important building blocks. So we want to show that the pro-environmental behavior is the norm or is ordinary. So some ways of doing that are providing positive social proof. So that would be things like sharing, for example, that 89% of students support efforts to reduce paper waste, or 71% of Haas students don't print lecture slides. So we can make these statements known, and that can also help to address if there are any misconceptions about the norm. So for example, there are often instances where people think that, you know, only 30% of students don't print their lecture slides, but when in fact 70% of students don't print their lecture slides, then that's when you want to emphasize that fact so that you can address and fix those misconceptions about the norm. We can also call attention to society's expectations. We do this especially if the existing norm isn't so great, then we don't want to be calling attention to the existing norm, but we do want to call attention to the expectation. And you can do this even when the norm is good. So this example here with Tim, it's still, you know, it's kind of saying, be like Tim. You know, the expectation is that you support efforts to reduce paper waste, reduce paper usage. And then also strengthening the norm through social networks, again with green teams, and also another example of sharing positive social proof. This example of the professors here, they're from Red River College, and from their participation in their paper saving campaign with our rep from Red River College, they ended up winning the sustainability award for their campus. And so these are the kinds of things that you want to share as much as possible. And so hopefully by sharing, you know, the fact that these faculty members won this award, then other departments might want to follow suit. We're almost done. Craft it to be relatable. So this is all about reducing the gap between the audience and the problem, or reducing that perceived gap. And so we want to always relate the message to what the audience already cares about. And again, this is where your determinants analysis comes in. You want to find out, do they care more about budget or the environment or efficiency or local or other campus issues or their health, and then focus your messages on those things. Also connecting to personal experiences. So for paper, this can be kind of hard. It may be easier for things like climate change, but you know, try to get creative and think about, you know, what's a personal experience related to having a messy desk, and how can you bring that top of mind for your audience? And then also focusing on individuals in order to foster empathy. So this is called the identifiable victim effect. So often focusing on one individual, which can also even be, you know, a cute animal like an owl, can be more effective than just giving people, you know, statistics about deforestation, for example. Also choosing appropriate messengers. Oftentimes, you know, well, most of the time, the appropriate messenger isn't you. And so you want to think about who is the appropriate messenger. And a lot of times it's students, obviously student to student, but we've also found that faculty are more receptive to what students want than staff, for example. And so if you are seeking to influence faculty, you might want to see how you can, you know, start with the students and how the students might be able to persuade faculty. Foster awareness. This does not refer to fostering awareness of the problem, raising awareness, how we often use it, but this is a little bit of a different building block and is more about how do we cultivate mindful awareness of our thought patterns. And so that is so that we can better align our actions with our intentions, both as, you know, individuals and our individual behaviors, but also as practitioners, so that we can be more effective environmental practitioners in our, you know, talking with other people. And it's definitely hard work, so we want to make sure that we're taking others' perspectives and are being mindful. So this is about noticing and overcoming our cognitive biases. Examples like moral licensing, status quo bias, ostrich effect. We talk about all of these in the toolkit, but And these are all things that can lead us astray and lead us to make decisions that aren't really ideal for us or the planet. And so this building block is all about how do we notice them, and then what can we do to overcome them. And then prompts can also help us with, reminding us to be mindful, basically. So prompts about think before you print and wait, can you recycle that? These are both from Elaine. So Elaine, do you want to talk about these at all?
Just briefly, the wait, can you recycle that? That was in response to when I did a pre-survey with staff and faculty at Pacific University. They were confused and they wanted more information. So this was an example of a prompt that I created specifically for that target audience, and through my post-survey data, it was very effective in helping them.
Thank you. Yeah, and we also in the toolkit have a few other examples of some of these prompts related to getting people to pause before they print. Last but not least, achieve lasting change. So this is all about how do we turn actions, how do we get not just the one-time actions, but long-term habit change ultimately. And so we can do this by capitalizing on periods of change, such as new staff orientation or new student orientation. Research shows us that when people are already in a state of change can be a really good time to start new habits. Building on a tiny behavior, so meeting people where they're at so that they're not getting overwhelmed and they're more likely to stay in the game longer and actually make changes in the long term and not get burnt out. But also influencing the very first choice, and again that can relate to periods of change when you're first interacting with someone. The schedule of benefits, so we go into a lot more detail about this in the toolkit, but it may be hard to believe, but sometimes using what's called a continuous reward or intermittent reward, which means that you're not actually rewarding someone every single time, this can actually lead to longer term behavior change. And finally, also providing feedback that can be ideally specific. We can also give real-time feedback and also showing change over time. This can be really important for, again, keeping people motivated and also showing people that what they're doing is actually having an impact or not. So then if it is, they're going to keep doing it. This blue one on the left here is an orientation slide for the Haas School of Business. So, see if you can talk about paper savings or the other sustainability campaigns during orientations. Talked about the lotteries, and then this example here is an example of real-time printing feedback from University of Michigan. And you can read more about that in the toolkit as well. All right, so now Elaine is going to tell us a bit about the intervention strategies that she used in her campaign.
Briefly, yes. One of the key strategies I used was to highlight the early adopters, and I personally went to our campus president, and here is an example of another high-level administrator, a dean in a department, and asked them to give up their personal printers. They did, and then I did some photo shoots and marketing and stories around that. So I used them to demonstrate, the moving towards the social norming, like, hey, the administrators are doing it. And the other thing I wanted to highlight about the dean, one of his biggest benefits that he saw for reducing his personal printer was he wanted more space on his desk. And that was not a benefit that I had considered in my pre-survey. So that's interesting.
Yeah, we also, that's a good point, because we've also found that with cohort 2, where everyone's doing the desktop printer removal, that has been a common thing that's been mentioned that we also had not really thought about before.
Yeah, that's what's so fun about the research. And of course, I gave myself as an example. In my office, we passed on the printer. We mainly had a printer because it only had scrap paper in it. So highlighted that. We also made a public vivid display in our student union where we highlighted our, found out how much paper is wasted on our campus every year. And that was 444 boxes, over 2,220,000 sheets of paper. And so we broke it down. This is an example of just a percentage of that, 44 boxes. And we did education around that for public.
Yeah, and then you can't really see it here, but they also, accompanied this information about the problem with the things that you can do to prevent the problem. So that's also really important.
Mm-hmm. We also benefited as we went into the print reduction with our Panther print program, which was the college starting to move towards managed print services, and also in tandem with our energy conservation efforts that I oversee on campus, which is called Power Shift. This is an example of a branding of our mascot. So we used our mascot a lot, Poppy the Panther. He's kind of fun. And this has really benefited our efforts as we're moving forward.
Great. Thanks, Elaine. And this is a screenshot. You might not be able to see it super well, but you'll find this in the toolkit. And essentially, this is kind of a roadmap for you to use to go from the barriers to the solutions. So, for example, we talked about if memory is the problem, then using things like prompts can be very powerful to remind people what to do. Examples, susceptibility, we can use principles from making it relatable and vivid in order to show people that the impact really does affect them, make that more salient to them. So essentially, this can serve as a roadmap for you to, once you know your determinants, how to select interventions. And we also have provided a worksheet where you can kind of jot down your ideas there. Once you know your drivers, space to brainstorm your intervention ideas. And finally, we also just wanted to, make a point to say that usually you're not just doing one intervention by itself, as you saw with Elaine's presentation, and also as you'll see in the case studies in the toolkit, we often are using a suite of complementary interventions that are all working together to really, become even more powerful. And often these are prompts, feedback, norms and commitments, and then how-to information. So less about information about the problem, but that how-to information about how to actually do the behavior. And you will see for sure all 5 of these in the Haas case study in the toolkit. And then resources. So as we've been talking about this entire time, the toolkit has been published and is ready for you to use. And in the appendix, it has all the worksheets. And we didn't talk about this much, but it also has a whole section about how to design a competition. As I mentioned, we have our book coming out in 2020 that will be an even deeper dive into all the things in the toolkit, and also it will not be focused specifically on paper, but we'll have examples from all different kinds of conservation and environmental behaviors. We also, I believe this is linked in the toolkit, we also put together a document that can help you make the case for desktop printer removal at your campus. So it highlights the benefits and also includes case studies from campuses about, how much money they saved, for example. So that's something you might be able to use. And then if you're interested in doing a desktop printer removal determinants analysis at your campus, we are in the process of doing kind of a meta-analysis of taking the data from many different schools to see what kind of patterns emerge and how there might be differences between different kinds of campuses. And so if you're interested in being part of that, reach out to us and let us know, and we can talk more about what that would mean to have you be part of that. And Elaine, are there any resources, any other resources that you would want to mention?
No, that's good.
Great. All right, thank you so much, everyone. And I appreciate everybody bearing with me in the beginning with my technical difficulties. And I think we can open it up for questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Lauren and Elaine. And we have a couple of minutes left for Q&A. And I'd like to remind everyone that you can submit your questions via the questions pane on the control panel. We do have a few, so I will go right to them. But I also linked the toolkit in the chat box, so you should be able to see that the toolkit that has been referenced throughout the webinar. So the first simple question is, how are Century Gothic and Garamond echo fonts?
Oh, okay. We know that one, I can't remember which one's which, but one of them uses less ink and one of them uses less space. And I can't tell you why, because I am not an expert in fonts, but they are apparently some of the most eco-friendly fonts.
Yeah, so Century Gothic uses the least ink, or it's in the top 2 least amount of ink users, and Garamond uses the least amount of paper.
Very interesting.
Very specific.
Yes. All right. So I think you addressed this, throughout the presentation, but this question came towards the beginning of your presentation. Some of the issues we have is with people preferring to read or take notes on paper versus electronically. We have faculty that have cited studies where people learn and retain better if they read from a paper document or book versus electronic. What has been a response to that, or how can we address those concerns?
Yes. Yeah, that is a very real concern. And specifically when we were working with the Haas School of Business, they were one of the projects that was focused on student printing, and that was a major concern. And so, for example, with that project, we through our conversations and interviews with students and then the survey, it was determined that something that would make sense would be to have the target behavior be for students to not print, to print anything that wasn't mandatory printing. And so, the goal not being that you're never printing anything, but that you're being more cognizant of what you're printing, and even things like just not printing the, if you have to print a reading, you don't really have to print like the 5 pages of citations at the end, unless you need those citations, you're writing a thesis or something. But most people don't really need the 5 pages of citations at the end. So I think that's a really good question, and also something that you'll want to kind of say up front in your campaigns too, so that you will get less pushback on that, making it clear that that that's the case for many people.
But one thing that we also heard as part of our determinants process is a lot of faculty believed that students wanted things to be printed. And yet when we surveyed the students, we found out that there was a mistaken norm. Yeah. Professors thought that the norm of who wanted this was much higher. And in reality, many students, their whole lives now are online, very different than in my generation. And so they actually wanted things to be digital.
Yeah, and so you can actually read more about that in the Fort Lewis case study in the toolkit. So professors were citing that as the reason they don't use Canvas. And so we said, well, what if we survey students and see what they actually think? And it turned out that students like to use Canvas and like to have things online instead of printed. And then they were able to use that information to address the faculty misconception.
Thank you. And Naya, do you mind hugging Lauren a little? Yes, there. We were seeing only half of your face. And,
I want to see you.
It was the best half.
Yeah. I also want to say something that I have a daughter and she's a high school student, and they went all digital. So everything happens on Google Classroom. So the new generations of students, they're used even from high school on being all digital. So, you know, we may think of college students differently, but they're learning this behavior even from high school. Okay, so in an organizational environment that is incredibly busy, how do you convince administrators and those with high levels of institutional authority that an intentional process such as these are valuable, and that time needs to be made to engage in evaluatory processes such as those outlined in the resources shared?
I'll start. In the beginning, we had that example of the ad that backfired, the big campaign to empower youth to say no to drugs. So what we would generally do is we would show decision makers what happens when they don't do something more intentionally. If there had been a certain amount of research ahead of time of that campaign, you know, a small pilot effort even, they would have realized this, and there would have been a ton of resources saved, as well as the fact that there would be a whole bunch of people that didn't start using drugs because they thought that that was the norm. Would you add anything? And then I would love to hear from Elaine too.
Yeah, I think, yeah, exactly what Naya said. And then also that, also just connecting it to what those administrators do care about. So we found that the schools that have been most successful are the ones that, because they've communicated with the top, especially about the financial savings, then they do have that buy-in from the high levels of authority, because it's not just about the environment, it's about the business case. And so communicate about that as well. And the case for desktop printer removal that's in the toolkit can also help with that.
And Elaine?
Yeah, I echo the fact that I always try to go up, can I get the president on board, and then can I get deans and division heads and directors on board? And it's a tough sell. There are times when it is, but I've been successful when I've been able to get executive support and buy-in, and then go from there. So I always start there in higher ed anyway.
Yeah, I think executives want to be effective, right, and don't want to waste their time. And so framing it as, if you do this intentional process in the beginning, we won't be wasting our time with a campaign that's not going to work.
Yeah, and making the business case too. You know, in our case, it was like, oh yeah, only saving $900,000 on paper if we were to go to managed print services, for example. Well, who wouldn't want to do that?
Yeah, it's a lot.
Exactly.
We do have one more question and one more minute, so I'm hopeful that we'll get through this quickly. Let me see, did we have, okay, just a comment of thanks to you. So the last question is, some of the interventions are simple in terms of manpower or even funding, and some are more complex. So which are some of the simplest ones that you can do to not tax the already, you know, very busy staff, and which are some of the most complicated and complex ones?
I always like to start with setting any default that we can, because it takes a certain amount from a couple staff to do that, but once that's done, it pays back in dividends.
Yeah, and I think the stuff from Make It Easy, a lot, which includes defaults, a lot of that is also pretty easy for you to do. But once you do it, you know, and it's not usually very controversial, and can have a big impact. Whereas, you know, things like a pledge campaign, or maybe, you know, managing a green team, or like a longer process is more work. Yeah, but I think, and the toolkit will definitely, I think, make some of that more clear of what things are a bit easier to do, but have a big bang for their buck.
Elaine, any more comments?
Yes, I agree. Just those simple, even the simple prompts or the simple messages that you know are going to have the high impact, or even in my case, you know, if I can get the president or a dean to send out some sort of a educational piece or data or findings, that can have a big impact.
Thank you so much, Elaine and Naya and Lauren, for presenting with us today and for working with us on this toolkit. We will take a break from webinars given the AASHE conference happening next week, and we'll be back in November actually with 2 webinars same week, November 12th and 13th. And I invite you to go to our website and see more about these 2 webinars. Let's Take the Climate Back, and one on universities scaling up sustainability together. So this is on an interesting network of universities working on food dining. And I thank you everyone for attending. We'll share the recording tomorrow as well as the slides, and you'll get an email once those are uploaded to the Campus Sustainability Hub. Thank you. Have a good day. Bye.
Bye. See you in Spokane.
See you.